Dear Minister, thank you very much for this sobering and thoughtful way of kicking off our conference. We will certainly continue to discuss many of these points made out on Leancolm this afternoon and tomorrow morning. I will now turn to our next speaker. Let me introduce Robert S. Ross, professor, as I said, at Boston College and associate at John Fairbank Center for Chinese Studies at Harvard University. He's one of the foremost American specialists on Chinese foreign and security policy, and his research focuses on the rise of China and Chinese use of force. His recent publication includes Strategic Adjustment and the Rise of China, written together with a Norwegian, Professor Øystein Tunsjø, and Power and Politics in East Asia and China in the Era of Xi Jinping, also written together with a Norwegian professor, Jo Inge Bekkevold, who is with us today. Thus, as you have guessed by now, Professor Ross has been in Norway before, cooperating with the Norwegian Defense University College and the Institute for Defense Studies, where he was adjunct professor between 2007 and 2016. Please, Professor Ross, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to Secretary General Hansen for the invitation. This is a very prestigious institution, a prestigious audience, so it's an honor to be here. And it's with much chagrin and sadness that I have to thank the Minister for having so much common sense in her talk, common sense we do not hear enough of back in my own country. I kept nodding my head up and down as I heard such wisdom. Bipolarity does not mean a new Cold War. China is both a competitor and a source of cooperation and opportunity. It's complex. We shouldn't simply discount it as simply a threat to our way of life. Containment will fail. It will fail with respect to China, and we'll hurt ourselves as well. What is required is negotiation, cooperation, and management of a new power. I encourage you to come to Washington often. We need your wisdom. What I want to talk about today is what's happening to the United States in its relationship with China, specifically about the changing balance of power in East Asia, what it means for the East Asian strategic order, how is Asia changing, how is the United States responding to this, and then what it means for Europe and NATO and U.S. cooperation in Europe. First, the changing balance of power. It could not be more abrupt, more fundamental, more consequential. And it's all in a span of 5 to 10 years, very quickly. Just to give you an example, since 2012, China's gone from 25 frigates to 45 frigates, from 0 corvettes to 40 corvettes, from their advanced submarines 0 to 25. That's all in 6 years. They have about 350 ships in the year 2020, and the United States has about 290. And the gap is growing. You may have read about the new budgets for the U.S. Navy in 2018, 2019, 2020. But what you may not read about is how many ships are being decommissioned simultaneously because they're old and it costs too much to maintain. And the production rate is not keeping pace with the rate of decommissioning. So the size of the Navy is declining in platforms as the size of the Chinese Navy is getting larger. In less than 10 years, the United States will have a naval fleet taking into account budget constraints and decommissioning of about 240 ships. We'll go from about 290 to 240. That's not my numbers. Those are the numbers of the Congressional Budget Office, which has a high degree of credibility for both impartiality and for their skills at accounting and budgeting. The trend, just take a look at it, 2019. The United States in 2019 commissioned 8 ships. China commissioned 28 surface ships in that same year. The U.S. commissioned 2 destroyers. China commissioned 10 destroyers in 2019. The United States commissioned 1 new submarine in 2019. China commissioned 3 submarines in 2019. In about 2030, China will have anywhere between 80 and 100 submarines. The United States will have approximately 40 attack submarines. These numbers are consequential. President Trump says he wants a 355-ship Navy. Well, again, the Congressional Budget Office will tell you that to reach that number, the United States has to spend on just its shipbuilding budget 1/3 more than the average rate of its shipbuilding budget for the last 30 years. Now, you may well ask, where's the money going to come from? It's a fair question. And again, we will have about 240 ships. China will have approximately 400 ships. But it's just not their shipbuilding. It's something far less difficult, far less technologically sophisticated, ballistic missiles that target fixed targets rather than moving targets at sea. So we hear about their DF-20, DF-21, DF-26. The ranges are such that they can target, just to make a long list for you, Singapore, Philippines, Malaysia, Japan, Guam. That is to say, every American facility in East Asia can be targeted with relative ease with Chinese intermediate-range ballistic missiles. And they have ship-based cruise missiles that are increasingly sophisticated with targeting and accuracy, with numbers that matter. So the latest Chinese destroyer, the O-55A, has 128 vertical launch cells. That's a lot of missiles in one ship. For those of you who may have been paying attention to what ships the United States have been building, we have a very rapid rate of production and shipbuilding and commissioning of our littoral combat ship. From what I can tell, it has no missile launchers. And in the 21st century, it's about missiles. Taken together, the shifting balance and capabilities with the rise of China's missiles, sea-based and land-based missiles, means the United States' access to facilities and bases in East Asia are no longer reliable or accessible in wartime. The United States cannot count on any of its traditional allies to provide it wartime support in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, the Yellow Sea, or the Taiwan Strait. That is a fundamental change in the East Asian balance of power. Or, as American naval leaders will put it, we spent 70% of our time training in the South China Sea, but our surface fleet will not fight in the South China Sea because the risks of the costs will simply be too high. As you can imagine, this has a fundamental implications for the regional order and for American alliance systems in East Asia. There's a tendency for us to say in the literature, countries balance. No, they don't. Countries don't balance. Great powers balance. Small powers put their finger up in the air, they see which way the wind is blowing, and they move with the wind. And every country in East Asia is doing that today. With the rise of China, there is a decline of the U.S., right? For every rising power, there's always a declining power. You can't have one without the other. And the entire region sees the United States relative to China as a declining power, and they are therefore losing confidence in America to fulfill its defense commitments to its post-World War II strategic partners. They can see the U.S. decline. They can see the shipbuilding trends. They can see the presence of the Chinese Navy and Coast Guard off their waters. As one Philippine legislator put it, we know who the real naval power is in East Asia. The United States Navy sails in and goes home. Chinese Navy here, they're here all the time. And that's how they experience it. So what is every country doing? They're all improving relations with China, every one of them. And they're all making clear that this requires an erosion of their relationship with the United States. If you're the United States and you see them cooperating more with China, you're going to have less confidence they'll cooperate with you. Alliance relations are zero-sum. You're cooperating more with the adversary, you're going to have less confidence they will cooperate with you. You see this in trends in actions and speeches in Malaysia, Singapore, Philippines, South Korea, Vietnam. Everyone is saying in one way or another, we are not going to take sides in the US-China competition. They're racing toward neutrality. Well, this is the problem for the United States, right? Since 1945, it's been the dominant maritime power throughout the world and in Southeast Asia and in the East China Sea. We built an alliance system that was the cornerstone of American security in the Pacific that lasted for 70 years, and now it's eroding. Change is hard. And how is the United States responding? Well, in two ways. One is responding by trying to increase its presence. So, you see America focusing on our phone ops, our freedom of navigation operations. Well, let's not kid ourselves. This is not about law of the sea. This is not about maintaining freedom of navigation. The last time I looked, there was no challenge to freedom of navigation, and nor do we see the Chinese Navy wanting to interdict trade. On the contrary, they are the ones that benefit most from trade through the Malaccan Strait through the region. So we will say, look at the statistics. East Asia is vitally important to world trade. Look at the trade that goes through East Asia, and 75% of it goes to China. East Asian trade routes are vital to China more than any other country. And the last time I looked, countries interdict sea routes between the great powers in times of war, not times of peace. What we're doing with our freedom of navigation operations is we are using them to signal our allies of our resolve to stand up to China, and we're signaling China of our resolve to deter use of force. How do we know this? Well, both in the Obama administration when this started and in the Trump administration, we put journalists on our aircraft to be able to observe our phone ops operations. We do phone ops every year against many countries. There's no publicity. There's no C-SPAN out there or CNN out there. We want this highly publicized to signal the region that we're there. That's what it's for. Put it differently, China doesn't like us going inside 12 miles of these man-made features, so we will go inside 12 miles as a signal of our resolve. Same thing in the Taiwan Strait. Our transits of the Taiwan Strait with our military ships has skyrocketed in the recent years. Is there a greater threat of a mainland attack on Taiwan? No. Is there greater instability? No. Why are we doing this? For the same reason. The mainland doesn't like it, so we're going to do it. It's a way to show the region that we are going to stand up to China. This is about presence. And our admirals say this. We're going to do phone ops to establish our presence. It's very clear. And we do it with speeches and rhetoric. In contrast to your foreign minister, our foreign minister and our vice president have lost a sense of nuance. China is a threat across the board, and they have raised the ideological specter of China challenging global values. And why are they doing this? To mobilize world opinion, mobilize domestic opinion, to see China as a threat. In some areas of academia, we call this threat inflation. And the purpose is to persuade Congress to increase budgets and to persuade the region to ally closer with the United States. Let's be clear, this has been ineffective at best. This began during the Obama administration, and the trend of our allies in East Asia moving toward the center has continued unabated. And it's done no good to influence Singapore, the Philippines, Malaysia, or South Korea, or Vietnam to lean greater toward the United States. On the contrary, they have been getting closer to China. Regarding Taiwan, we send ships through the Taiwan Strait. China sends its bombers around Taiwan Island. We send ships through the Taiwan Strait. They send their carrier around Taiwan. The people in Taiwan can see very clearly that the future in the Taiwan Strait is China, not the American Navy. Well, are we going to spend more money? No, we're not going to spend more to increase our defense budget. Simply put, the money is not there. The 2001, the Congress reached an agreement for a 2-year defense budget, 2020 and 2021. The 2021 defense budget's flat. China's rising, its ships are growing, and we are not going to increase defense spending in 2021. We will try and allocate it better, but the budget will not go up. Well, maybe we can reallocate money within the federal budget. No, we can't do that either. 70% of the American budget goes to what we call social welfare programs that cannot be reduced, whether it's Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, welfare, so on and so forth. 70% of the American budget is locked. That gives you 30%. Of that 30%, 55% already goes to the Department of Defense. And that doesn't include Coast Guard, nuclear weapons, and Veterans Affairs. What else is in that other 30%? Education, infrastructure, which the American people believe needs major reinvestment, and in which the American people believe, if you look at public opinion polls, their budget priority for defense is about 15th on the list. So the idea that we can reach into that, what's left of that discretionary budget, that's not going to happen. We're not going to raise taxes. On the contrary, President Trump lowered taxes to stimulate an already growing economy. So in a very unusual situation, the American economy is growing and revenues are declining because of tax cuts. And the budget is going up. And we will not cut entitlements because there's no political will on either side of Republicans or Democrats to cut entitlements and risk their electoral prospects. The contrary, in the first year of the Trump administration, entitlements went up for prescription drugs to reduce the cost of prescription drugs. Well, maybe we can print more money, right? Well, the federal deficit's already off the charts, and you start printing more money to fund DOD, you're going to make China stronger, not weaker. The fundamental underlying resource for contending in great power politics is to healthier economy, and it would not do the United States well to increase its deficit by printing more money. Maybe we can reallocate funds within the DOD. The United States doesn't have really good strategic planning when it comes to its defense budget. 1/3 for the Navy, let's say 30% for the Navy, 30% for the Army, 30% for the Air Force, and 10% for the Secretary of Defense office. No way to manage a budget. Well, recently you may have heard the Secretary of the Navy said, we need more money for ships to deal with China. The next day the Army said, Navy already gets too much. And the day after that, the Air Force says, we need more money for airplanes. And if you're in Congress and you see the Army, you see bases everywhere in your district supporting your local economy. The political will to go after DOD and say, cut the Army, cut your deployments, reallocate to Asia, highly unlikely. That's what should happen. That should be the easiest of everything I mentioned, and that seems highly unlikely. So what's the Secretary of the Navy said? Well, what's the Navy's #1 priority? The new Columbia-class submarine to maintain America's sea-launched nuclear deterrent. That's very wise. I think that's a good thing. What's his #2 priority? Our attack submarines, our nuclear-powered attack submarines, he said. That's good, but he said that's going to be a struggle, given how much the Columbia-class submarines are. And then he says, what's third? The surface fleet. And he doesn't know how he's going to fund the surface fleet to maintain a strong surface fleet. And what does that mean? Aircraft carriers. So he understands that the budget for the surface fleet will likely decline relative to our attack submarines and our ballistic missile submarines. That's his words, not mine. And can we count on American technology? No, you can't count on American technology. It's still much better than China's. But as we all know, reading the news every day, whether it's artificial intelligence, whether it's 5G and Huawei, China is doing quite well. They're catching up. You can't be confident that you can maintain sufficient superiority in technology to compensate for the closing gap in platforms. China's doing drones. China's doing satellites. They're quite capable. This is not the Soviet Union. This is a country with a real economy and a real technological educational institutions. And altogether, we should understand that China is better positioned to race the United States. The United States is to race China. America's acquisition budget is only 30%. The Navy's acquisition budget is only less than 30% of the Navy's total budget. Personnel costs are off the charts. Maintenance and operations are off the charts. Our defense budget is 3% of GDP. China's is about 2% of GDP. They can raise defense spending with less impact on their economy. Their growth rate, even today, is twice the rate of the American growth rate, so all things being equal, they can increase defense spending twice as quickly as the United States can. Their shipbuilding capacity. They have the largest shipbuilding industry in the world at about 30%. The United States has 1% of shipbuilding capacity. So they take those shipyards that are making merchant ships, commercial ships, and they can make naval ships out of them. China doesn't have overseas wars that drain their budget. They don't have 100 bases and facilities around the world that drain their budget. They don't have a volunteer army. Their benefits for their military is very low. And they don't do one-third, one-third, one-third. Their Navy has been growing at a much faster rate than their ground force over the past decade. The U.S. has a mantra: strengthen our alliances. Every think tank report, every speech in Washington, we need to strengthen our relations with our traditional allies. Good luck. Without the underlying capabilities, all the presidents and all the phone ops amount to this very sophisticated social science word, cheap talk. And our allies know it. And that's why they're moving to the center, and that's why they say they won't take sides. So what is our other response? We can't spend money. We call this the Indo-Pacific Strategy. And I find this to be a wise, constructive approach to American security. Implicit in the Indo-Pacific Strategy is acknowledgement of America's inability to access Southeast Asia, the South China Sea, and other internal seas in East Asia during wartime. And when the United States needs to pull back, it needs to retrench to find facilities elsewhere in Asia that will allow America the security during wartime to use those facilities and then project power from outside the first island chain where we can deploy our surface ships and project power in. Places where the U.S. can be assured of maritime access, and we can constrain China from having access. We talk about China having an access denial strategy. Yes, they do, and it's been quite successful the last 5 years, but America's policy has an access denial strategy to deny the Chinese Navy access to the Indian Ocean and the Western Pacific. And that's an entirely feasible strategy to which we are now building the resources and the basing facilities to make that happen. India. We always used to say about India, they'll never cooperate with the United States. They have too much pride in their non-aligned policy. Not anymore. Not with that Chinese Navy in the Indian Ocean all the time. We're now getting good access to the east coast of India, and our relationship is growing. And India is developing an Air Force capability in Andaman Islands and not doing it for themselves. They won't say the U.S., but that will be a U.S. facility if necessary. Western Australia, basically a major hub, the American hub for C4ISR in all of Asia. And north of Australia, south of Indonesia, is a place called Cocos Island, which Indonesia is building up their presence and the Air Force capabilities there, and they're not doing it for Indonesia, they're doing it for the United States. Papua New Guinea, Manus Island, southern Papua New Guinea, i.e. the part of Papua New Guinea in the Indian Ocean. Australia is refurbishing that base with cooperation with Papua New Guinea. They're not doing it for Papua New Guinea, they're not doing it for Australia, they're doing it for the United States. Federated States of Micronesia, we're cooperating strong to develop a naval facility in the Federated States of Micronesia. And Japan, where's the Yokosuka Naval Base? It's on the east coast of Japan, outside the first island chain, where the United States can sail in and out with relative security. This is America's new defense strategy to deal with China in the 21st century. Maintain a balance of power in East Asia with assets, access, facilities outside East Asian seas. So, the United States, with less resources and declining resources, is struggling to balance China, while we're watching U.S. alliances degrade on a daily basis, without the money or the resources to compete inside East Asia. What does all this mean for Europe? What does all this mean for NATO? Well, first of all, it should be clear that the United States cannot do two theaters at once. We do not have the money. We cannot do wars in the Middle East and contend with China and Asia. we do not have the money. It's a difficult transition. So you see the United States saying, we're going to leave the Middle East, and President Obama gets sucked back in. President Trump says, we're going to leave the Middle East, and we get sucked back in. Change is hard, but it's happening. China's a real concern, and it has a real military with less burdens than the United States has, and it has geographic advantages being inside the region, which makes it less costly for China to operate in East Asia and to be equally effective in East Asia with less platforms because of geographic proximity. So we look at Donald Trump. And of course, in any foreign policy, there is a question of means and ends. And there is a consensus in the Washington community that some of the objectives that President Trump expresses are shared. Europe must do more. The U.S. must retrench from East Asia. The U.S. must end its wars in the Middle East. The United States should expect more from Europe. All that's agreed upon. But just like whether it's the WTO or whether it's relation with South Korea, the process can be important as how you get there. And you don't want to bring down the WTO to change the international trade rules, and you don't want to erode NATO, European confidence, and American credibility in an effort to get Europe to do more. Trade wars with our European allies don't help. This has been counterproductive, and I would suggest unnecessary. European leaders can look at Asia, they can look at American defense budget, they can look at the U.S.-China trade, U.S.-China military balance, and they know that America is going to be in Europe less in the future than today. That's what makes it credible, not President Trump's speeches, but the reality in U.S. defense spending and the reality in the U.S.-China balance. So how does America see European security? Well, we see Russia's declining power. It could, yes, it's being more provocative, more belligerent, but in terms of the resources it can bring to the table in European security affairs, it is a declining power. Its defense budget's declining this year. Relative to every other European country, its GDP is declining every year. Europe, I like to compare Russia to North Korea and Pakistan because their defense policies are the same. No money facing a major threat, what do? Intermediate range ballistic missiles and hypersonic weapons because you can't afford a ground force, you can't afford a navy, no better than North Korea can, no better than Pakistan can, so you go for cheap weapons that are effective, hypersonics and intermediate range ballistic missiles. This is not a threat of offensive action from Russia. This is a country with the GDP the size of Spain, and we should recognize it as such. So we recognize it as a country that Europe can handle on its own, on a daily active basis. I look at Europe, and going back, bipolarity is not another Cold War. Europe, to me, if I look at its geopolitics, its great power relations, sort of reminds me of Europe from 1870 to, let's say, or 1860s to 1890. A lot of great powers out there. No one's dominant. No one's poised to take it over. Shifting relations among themselves to maintain stability. Russia's not the Soviet Union. Germany is not the Germany of 1912. This is a fairly self-contained system that can do a good job of maintaining a balance of power because there is no overarching threat of any power for hegemony. The Middle East. The United States cannot fight endless wars in the Middle East. We need to prioritize China and our interests. We don't buy oil from the Middle East. We're self-sufficient in our energy resources. We should understand that America's commitment to the Middle East has reflected our interest in our allies having secure and reasonably priced access to natural resources and the strength of our commitment to Israel. Two things are going on here. One, Israel has never been more secure. Iran's a basket case, Iraq's a basket case, Syria's a basket case, Lebanon's a mess, Egypt's a mess. There is no threat to Israel. It's never been more secure. And second, I forgot second. Second, we've been defending European and Japanese oil for a long time. We expect Europe to do more to defend access to their own resources. I look at the Med, I look at North Africa and the Middle East, and what do I see? I see Europeans, Caribbean. The Caribbean is America's backyard, the most vital security interest in the United States. That's what the Mediterranean is to Europe. And so there's an expectation, given America's priority in Asia and given European resources, it will take a greater hand in its own backyard where its vital security interests are at stake. The Med is a small lake. From Italy to Libya is really very close. That's something that Europe, we expect, would focus more on. So what's this mean for NATO? Well, any alliance is a mutual cooperation alliance. To keep the U.S. engaged in NATO, NATO has to contribute to U.S. security. But of course, to keep NATO stable, the United States has to contribute to European security. It's a two-way street. But what can Europe do to contribute to U.S. security to maintain the strength of NATO? Well, I will first say, not in Asia. The United States is going to turn to Europe and say, can you send a ship down to the South China Sea and participate in this exercise we're doing? And it would be wise of Europe to say yes, whether it's France or Germany or Britain, yes. But we understand this is an intermittent, periodic, short-term presence that has no impact on American security in East Asia, and you should understand that China doesn't care. So that contribution to America in Asia is something you can do, you should do, because it doesn't help to say no, but it has no implications on European presence, on the European contribution to European security, because it's short term, it's one ship, and then you go back to the Med or back to the North Sea. Not a big issue. But that's not how we're going to keep NATO intact. We maintain the stability of NATO by having a European contribution to Europe and the Middle East. The United States understands that the challenges in Europe, Middle East, North America are more than sufficient for the European powers in the context of the challenges and the constraints on defense spending. So Europe to Asia is not an expectation nor a necessity. But neither is the challenge of the high-tech warfare to the United States and China. It's important, but understand two things. One, the American effort to contain all technology transfer in cooperation with China does not reflect pure security. My own sense is the British approach, the forthcoming French approach, is you can have Huawei participate in your civilian sectors, and you should be able to contain your defense communication systems. After all, China's been penetrating our systems for the last 20, 30 years, and at the same time, we try and keep our backbone defense intelligence communication systems secure. That will be the challenge in the future as well. We are doing this as part of what President Trump calls our all-of-government approach. Just like everything else, he doesn't want to take down sanctions in our trade war. He wants to keep them in place. And he wants to try and weaken Chinese tech industries by denying cooperation. That will not be possible. DOD pushed back hard 2 or 3 days ago and said you cannot deny American high-tech companies from selling to China, otherwise they will not survive, they will go bankrupt, and the U.S. military will not have suppliers. The supply chains are so intertwined that it is in the American interest not to blockade transfers to China. Second, NATO is far more important to rise and fall on tech transfer policies. Too important in the United States. And so the American response to the British decision to allow Huawei into their civilian infrastructure, Pompeo made it clear the special relationship is strong and thriving. Great Britain called upon Washington's bluff, and basically Washington blinked. NATO was too important to use tech transfer to determine the rise and fall of NATO. What can Europe do? It can help in Europe and the Middle East. We have common interests. There is a U.S.-European interest in dealing with Russia. There are common interests in the Middle East. There are common interests in the Persian Gulf and North Africa. The question is how we pursue these common interests. And we believe there is now a disproportionate European interest in these regions compared to the U.S. interest. During the Cold War, that interest was mutually shared 50-50. We thought it was as vital to America during the Cold War as it was to Europe. We can't say that anymore. There's a disproportionate European interest in Russia, in the Middle East, in Northern Africa, compared to the American interest. So there is an expectation there will be a disproportionate European contribution to dealing with Russia, dealing with North Africa, dealing with the Middle East. I didn't say all, I didn't say total, I said disproportionate. The U.S., we have an institutionalized alliance. At every functional level, at every service, the cooperation goes on day in and day out. Planning goes on day in and day out. That's not going to change. When we have diplomatic spats with countries around the world, our intelligence communities go on sharing. That's not going to change. At the same time, our common interests are going to drive us to continue to plan together and how we can cooperate together. The only difference is, given the disproportionate interest that Europe has, there's an expectation of a disproportionate contribution. With a European contribution that carries a weight commensurate with its interests, I think, personally, NATO is stable and will continue to prosper. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this, Professor Ross. I would like the Foreign Minister and Ross to take a seat up on the podium.